Good morning and welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. The TC Dojo is a TechCom community that is driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn. You choose the topics and we find the experts. In the TC Dojo open session today, we have Mary Anthony as our visiting dojo master. Mary has co-founded a company, she's managed writing teams, developed documentation deployment infrastructure. She has designed user interfaces. She's worked for over 9 startups, both local and remote, around the world. Her experience is wide and varied. She's worked in open source, clinical research, UI design, and various technologies. She's been an API writer, a project manager, a tools developer, and an RFP writer. She knows firsthand that working on an open source project can catapult your career in a new direction. We're delighted she agreed to be our visiting TC Dojo master today. Now, Mary asked that you hold questions until the end, so be sure to type them in when you think of them so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. All right, Mary, I will pass control to you.
Okay.
Show your screen, and it's all yours.
All right. Show my screen.
There we go.
I think we'll keep the cursor hidden, and I'm going to just play this. So everybody should see the first screen, Expanding Horizons, Open Source, Social Coding, and Your Career.
Perfect.
And thank you for being here this morning, everybody. So a little bit about this talk, a talk on the talk. If you do research, there's on your profession, you'll know that the government keeps statistics on different professions, and you'll be happy to know that technical writing is a profession with what the government calls a bright outlook. And I think that the sun is very bright in the open source area. So this discussion, this talk, this webinar is about open source environments and tools and what you'll find there. So hopefully you'll learn about a little bit about open source if you don't already, how it is funded, because if we take a job in an area, we want to make sure they have money to pay us. You'll understand a little bit about who's using open source and why they care about it in the engineering or development community, and you'll get a little insight into social coding and how it relates to open source. And we'll learn some reasons that this area is changing technical writing. And hopefully maybe you'll get some ideas about how to leverage this information in your own career. I think Liz gave me a great introduction. Thank you, Liz. It sounded really good to me. But I have worked with a lot of startups. I'm currently working remotely for a startup, a blockchain startup out of New York City called Blockstack. I've worked for a number of other startups, Atlassian, Palantir, Docker, eBay. I've done a lot of different things. I think it helped me do that. Moving around helped me a lot. And I think it's always interesting to find out why people change jobs. Oftentimes I like to change jobs just because I've decided I'm a serial technologist, meaning I usually change because writing as from day to day sort of stays the same, but the technology changes. So oftentimes I take a job not because they're going to pay me more, or they're going to give me some sort of position, or I'm going to work with somebody that I worked with before, but often I change jobs because I'm interested in the tools that they're using, or I'm interested in the technology that they're working on. And blockchain is a new area for me. It's an interesting area if you are looking in, if you have an interest in politics. Surprisingly, blockchain has aspects of that. So it's always interesting to ask people why they've changed jobs. So this is my 10th startup. It's a blockchain startup, and I'm there because it's an interesting area and new. So where I am right now, they do have an open source component, open source software, or OSS. Everybody, I guarantee you, you all have probably used some type of open source software. Chrome is actually considered open source. So they create software. Open source companies, maybe Git, if you've used Git, if you've used Hadoop, if you use Linux, or a variant of Linux, you probably have used some open source software. So how do they make money? So if I went to work for an open source company, if they're giving away their software, which is essentially what they do, they give away their source code, how are they making money that they can pay me with? So they do a number of different things. Sometimes what these companies do is they create software for the public, and then they create private software that they sell. So they make money off the private version. So they might make an open source version that's anybody can download, and then an enterprise version, which is something that Docker has done. Or they might sell their product all open source, but sell support for the product. So there's just various different ways that they do make money. So it can be very lucrative for a company to do this. One of the things that I use to sort of gauge the community that I work in is to use the Stack Overflow developer survey. So they do a survey every year. I've been following them since 2012, the surveys themselves. Developers are, of course, the users of much of the technical documentation that's out there. And as writers, we know that there are a great deal of the people that we have to work with. So it's good to look at the survey and see how these people operate. And there's a deep connection between Stack Overflow developers and open source. And so the survey is a good insight into that. So they often survey on different things related to that. And so if you look at open source, new companies often grow out of that. So developers are interested in contributing to open source. And there's a great, almost 50% of developers do contribute to open source. It's higher among professionals as opposed to people who are trying to break into the coding industry. But there are a lot of people that go to open source to learn how to program. So I always wonder if you've contributed to open source. I would love to hear your experience. Maybe mention that in the webinar. But I would suspect among the writing community, it's probably a bit lower than 40% of those of us who have contributed to open source. I think it's really interesting too that if you look at the survey, they always ask, how do developers learn on their own? And this is a good resource for you if you're trying to sell to your management hiring another writer. So official documentation is the standard or of products or standards for technologies, or where developers go to learn about something that they're trying to code. And secondarily, of course, Stack Overflow is happy to see that followed closely behind are questions and answers on Stack Overflow. It's interesting if you look at their all respondents versus professional developers, it actually goes up slightly higher, the number of people that are using official documentation. And there's some interesting research out here that I'll post a link to this research that was done on the academic side of technical writing, that fully 80% or higher of anybody in any professional realm is using official documentation to learn how to do their job. So the idea that you could not provide documentation or spend less money on documentation is kind of, let's hope it's becoming more passé. If it hasn't, sometimes you can sort of point this out to people through these types of surveys. But if you look at the Stack Overflow surveys, so I've been looking at them from 2012, they used to ask what are the challenges at work, and they used to actually include documentation in the challenges list. It's changed in 2016, but documentation was always in the top 3 as a problem. Like if you're trying to do something at work, it was a huge challenge for you to get your work done because you had really bad documentation. Not surprising given the previous question that they asked. Interesting enough, Stack Overflow stopped asking this question in 2016 because in 2017 they created a documentation site as an internal project, and we're asking for contributions from the community, a form of open source. Maybe we can solve this problem for engineers because they're using Stack Overflow. We can provide them with documentation, and we'll see if we can do this. In other words, they were trying to solve the complaints that they saw with more documentation. A year later, they closed this. Interesting blog to read. I have a link in the reference at the end of the page about why they closed it. But essentially, they don't get the level of contributions that they need. We all know that documentation isn't just about writing that procedure the first time, but writing the procedure again when the software changes, updating it because there's an error in it or an error in the software, just the ability to track that the software is changing is a very difficult problem that we have other software to solve, and who's watching the issues that are coming in. So it was very costly for Stack Overflow to try to create a documentation site that paralleled the depth of technologies that their questions and answers did. But of course, their questions and answers can only go so far because answers age out with product as well. So this is another form of open source. You could actually go onto Stack Overflow and start answering questions about your product. That would be another way to actually contribute. But a big way that people are contributing to open source is they're using open source and social coding sites. So GitHub is probably the most famous. This is where 40% of the developers we know from Stack Overflow that are contributing to open source, they're probably using GitHub or they're using BitBucket. And if you see, or if you know a developer and you look at their resume, they've probably got their GitHub handle or their BitBucket handle or their social coding handle, like their LinkedIn profile or their Twitter account. They'll have a social coding site, their GitHub profile handle. So what other kinds of companies, what kind of companies are participating in open source? Well, big ones that you might want to work for. Facebook, Google, IBM, Microsoft, all these companies. For example, Android, Chromium, AngularJS, those are all software that you're probably familiar with. You might not be aware they're open source, and you could go on to Google's open source projects and contribute to those. Developers do it all the time. If you're using an ASCII text editor like Atom, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, also open source, that's by GitHub itself. React Native and GraphQL are two very up and coming, well, React's been around for a while, but GraphQL is pretty new and very cool. Open source started with Facebook, and Bootstrap, which you might know if you work with UI coders, also an open source from Twitter, and my own company, Blackstock. So these are these companies. If you want to get a job with Google and you want to get their attention, you could send your resume like everybody else, or you could go on and start as a writer contributing to Google's open source project. And we'll talk about how to do that. I think open source is a good fit for writers. A lot of open source projects are looking for people to provide them with documentation because it's so frequently that we all know documentation is overlooked when developers are coding. They'd rather be coding than they would be writing. It's not universal, but it's a pretty solid generalization. And so most open source projects are pretty happy if you go and contribute to them, and they want you to stay around. And so it's a fit because a lot of the documentation you'll find often there is source there, but it isn't good quality source documentations. There's structural problems because it's sort of like when you're designing content by committee, oftentimes the overview, the larger editorial view, so you could go in there and just contribute by rearranging things and then just updating. That's also something that's not done a lot. The documentation is written and then it lies fallow. So writers are very much needed in open source. And as I said, projects are really looking for people, and it's a good way to get capture attention of someplace where you're looking to get a job. So like when Blockstack was interviewing me, one of the very first things I did was go and contribute to their project. That gives me two things. It lets them see what kind of work I produce, and it allows me to see how their project is handled, which can be an interesting thing. We'll go over a little bit more about how an open source project is run. So open source, to me, it's the great wide open. Well, let me give you a little brief tour of one of these social coding sites, which is GitHub. So I'm going to go out here for a second. Hopefully you can still see. I'm going to pop up, well, actually, those are the references that I'll show you at the end of the day. But this is my GitHub profile. I usually just have this on my tab up here at the top, and I go here at the very beginning. I have a raven as my handle picture. It's very familiar if you've worked with any kind of social site. You get a picture, you get a handle, you can take a little phrase. Moxie Girl, I created this many years ago after my dog, who's since passed away, It's probably a good idea if you're a woman to think about your handle before you create one. It's probably not always good to advertise you're a woman when you're sort of entering into the coding realm where a lot of hackers are, but you know, you can put a more professional handle. I was just at the point in my life where I was like, I'm not sure about this. But this name has been attached to a lot of different, this handle has been attached to a lot of different projects, and at this point, I'm not going to change it. Interesting thing, you could see all the contributions. So recently started my new job with this new open source. Before I was a little bit lackadaisical back in 2015 when I was working for Docker. I wasn't so lackadaisical. Started to fizzle out a little bit later, and now I'm back up to my usual speed, which it's interesting. I work with coders. When I was working at Docker, somebody came up to me and said, oh my God, your profile is badass. And the reason they say that is if they're a developer, they're going to look here and they're going to see what's the rate at which you contribute. They'll look at organizations you work for. They'll look at the repositories, and they can actually drill down into the code that you've done. So also, I can look up here and see code changes that I've done. Like this is something I'm doing for a different project, not the current project, a tool called Gatsby, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So GitHub's super useful. You can go to the very top of GitHub. This is my dashboard. They just started this, so I'm not really clear on what they're trying to do here. But if you go to GitHub, you can sort of face like our team. Let me go back to me. Our team is Blockstack, so if I wanted to look at Facebook, I should just be able to do Facebook here and see all the tools that Facebook does. I think Google also has this, but they also have their own coding sites. So that's a way you can start to browse around, and you can also look at the Explore feature on GitHub to find different tools. The way the social coding works, let me see here and make sure I'm starting from scratch, is all your work is done in your own area, and you make what's called a pull request back to the people that own the core company that has the software you're contributing to. So in this case, there's this tool called Gatsby.js from this company called Gatsby. And so what I did is I went into the repository. You're going to fork it, which I have already forked it, just a little tool like this. Thing to keep in mind if you're exploring or you start to explore GitHub is almost everything you see is clickable. So if I'm looking at, say, Gatsby.js, and I look at their Gatsby project, I can look at things about that to learn more, like, are they having a lot of issues? These are issues like you're probably familiar with from Jira. And so they have 939 open issues. And then they have 46 pull requests. So they have pull requests that are coming from inside the company, and these are code changes that people are submitting to them. So it's sort of like, I tweaked this, would you take this on and pull it into your code base? And they have 8 projects, so I can get a glimpse into how they run their things. And then you can see insights around this particular project. So I know that this project is pretty active. I can tell by how recently, the last an hour ago, somebody had some code merged into the project. I can look and see how many contributors they have. And so that's a good idea. Like, say you wanted to contribute to a project, should you just pick any old project? Or do you want to pick a super popular project? It kind of depends on what you're trying to do. So I can see that they've got a lot of contributors. I can see a list of them. I can even drill down into how many commits they've done. So this person did 11, but then this person up at the top has done, and he's actually the guy that started this project, so he's going to have a lot more commits. They also have a bot that's using his name, so he sort of gets bounced up. You can see things about the community, like, are they meeting the community guidelines that GitHub is expecting? And all of these things, it's sort of like when you're looking to contribute to open source, you want to look at the viability of the project. How many people are interested in it? Is it active? So when Blockstack was interviewing me, I wanted to look at, okay, how many issues do they have open? Are they responding to them? Do they have a README? Do they have a code of conduct? All those kinds of things. Very helpful, and it's all viewable through GitHub. And so once I decided that I wanted to participate in this community, I was working through their tutorial, I ran into an issue, I forked their repository, I then made some changes to some files. Those come across as commits. People can look at it and look at that particular commit and see what I changed. I had a whole conversation with a couple of people on here about why I changed certain things the way I did. I made some tweaks to what I did. They'll review it, and at the end of it, your code's in, and I have a commit into a repository that I might not have otherwise looked at. But now they know, oh, this person's a contributor, and we'll see what happens. Do they try to get me to contribute again? Is that it? Or maybe I'll meet somebody through this. So it is very much a social platform. So that's GitHub. BitBucket is very similar. They're done by Atlassian. GitHub itself was recently purchased by Microsoft, if you don't follow that kind of thing. So that was a big deal because Microsoft wasn't previously known to be a big push in the open source area, but they actually do have, I know, some repos, and I think they're on GitHub. They should be now. There we go. So if you want to get a job with Microsoft, you might want to look. Is there a tool there that you could help with? All right, back to the presentation. So that was a brief tour of GitHub. Now I'll reinforce a little bit what I talked about so quickly there. So how do you contribute? So usually every repository you go to will have a file on that tells you exactly how to contribute. This file is pretty straightforward, but some of them can be poorly written. Fixing the contribution README is often one of the very first things that you can do to help somebody out, and they'll appreciate it. So you want to look for a contributor's guide when you go to a repository and just see this is what they're looking for. This is how they expect you to interact with them. Most repositories have a common design or a common organization across their code base. So remember, this is source code, but it will also usually include a docs directory. There's usually issues and labels on those issues. So I think I briefly stepped on one of those issues, like here's an example down here that somebody filed, and you can see that there's particular labels. It's a bug. It has an impact on their command line interfaces. Usually the common design includes that contributor, which talks about how they accept contributions. Some people just merge and don't go through a review process. Other ones have a pretty extensive review process when you do things with a repository. One of the things to keep in mind here too is an issue. If you are just using somebody's open source software and you write an issue or you run into a problem, an issue itself is contribution. So if you write a really good issue and you find something for them, you're helping them out. So typically, if you decide you're going to contribute code, you have a workflow. This workflow can be dictated to some extent by the contribution guidelines. It's also dictated a bit by how GitHub works. So you find an issue, you might go to the issue and say, I'll work on this, and put a comment in GitHub. Then you get your fork. Forking is just a means of copying the content from their repo to your repo so that you have a copy of it to work on. Then you use Git, or some tools will actually use Mercurial. Git is a command line user interface. Here you can see, I think I've got some Git commands now. That's npm. Okay, here you have, and I'll try to blow this up so everybody can see. Git's a pretty broad command line. I'd say it's very extensive. There are other tools out there. Just a little advertisement here. If you're going to do contributions to code repositories, I really recommend using the command line to do this work. Some people are intimidated by the command line, but I will tell you something fun about code repositories. You're working on a copy. It's really, really, really difficult for you to hurt their master repository. You can obviously bunk up your copy, but they have to go through a whole process before they accept your code. And even if they were to accept your code and there was to be a problem, Git allows you to back it out. So you can think of these things as ways of making multiple, and there's actually this term in Git called clones. There's clones of the code repository, which is very difficult as a writer if you wanted to make a change to hurt somebody else. So you should be bold. Go ahead and use the command line. I will tell you this, if you start to contribute and you're using a GUI and you run into problems, if you're using the command line, somebody will be able to help you. But if you're using one of these simplified Git interfaces, oftentimes there are far fewer people that know that interface. And many times I've run into problems where those interfaces don't even allow you to do the things you could do to fix the problems that the command line would let you do. All the writers that I hired at Docker learned the command line, and in some cases they're helping the developers, but they could get themselves out of trouble. So I really don't recommend you using a GUI for Git. If you're working, you fork the repository, which is a way of copying it on GitHub, and then you clone it locally with Git. Cloning is just a copy to your local machine. Then you can work on the code like you're authoring any other kind of document. You can sync it back, because while you're working on your code change, people are working on other code chains, so there's a sync process. And then you'll, at some point, make a pull request back to the people that own the code and say, hey, here, I've made a change for you. Do you want to accept it? And there'll be a review process, and then they'll merge it, and you'll have copy of your work for anybody to see who went and visited your profile on GitHub. Now, this looks complicated, and it might feel intimidating, but actually, once you've worked through this, you'll find, and I have found universally, that the people that work in open source are in large part more welcoming and more socially adept than you might find in a closed community. It's just because they're interacting with people all over the world. So who is your audience? This is really interesting. When you're working with an open source project, it's usually a user who works with the software to perform some tasks. That's true. That's what you would expect. But it's also, in the open source world, a contributor. Because oftentimes, the people that are reviewing your material, the people that are looking at your issues, are somebody who's modifying the software. So that's a big audience. Also, the documentation in open source. A contribution guide in an open source project is not intended for a developer as much as a contributor. So yes, developers are contributors, but also people who create issues, also people who maybe want to design a logo. So it's interesting to think there's a wider audience in open source, so you can write for different types of people. And while every user in open source is not a contributor, not every developer that you run into on the open source would be a contributor. They might be an internal user of that software, an internal, like for example, if you're on a Google open source project, some people will be from outside Google, some people will be from inside Google, excuse me. But every contributor is always a user. So anybody who is actually working on an open source process, writing an issue, they're always using that software. So it's an interesting way of looking at an audience, and it really can be a new type of user that you have to think about when you're writing for these types of audiences. So we talked a little bit, a new feature, new code. You can write tests. You can also help other people. You can answer issues, some issues that are loaded up. If you're just sort of interested in Chrome and you're really good at Chrome, you could go to the Chromium project in Google and start helping people who have issues. Not every issue is a problem with the software. Some of it is something that somebody just needs support on. You can also host meetups. If you're super interested in Chrome and you know everything about Chrome, you could host a meetup about Chrome, like host a meetup at a senior center. All these kinds of things are things that open source projects consider contributions. You can write a blog post. We had a lot of people doing that at Docker. Or, of course, as a writer, you could do documentation. And just think, if you're trying to break into marketing, maybe you want to put some marketing material out. A blog is a good way of marketing a part of a material. So it's also not just a way of advancing a technical writing career, but it's a way of advancing some other career interests that you might have that might lead to a totally different career. Who contributes? Okay, we've seen earlier from the Stack Overflow that experienced developers contribute. Also, people wanting to be developers, or as I just said, if you want to break into marketing, if you wrote a blog about how cool the latest release of Chrome is and why you find it cool, you can be showing, like, I understand products. I understand how to promote products. So it's not just experienced developers or people wanting to be developers, but it could be people who want to break into marketing. And also the geography of who contributes to open source is really one of the most exciting things about contributing to it. When I was working at Docker and when I'm working at Blockstack, I'm talking to people from all over the world. I'm talking to people in the Netherlands, I'm talking to people in China almost on a daily basis. And it's interesting to get that perspective, this non-US perspective. I remember I was talking about an issue with somebody who happened to be in China, and he was like, oh, well, I don't want to do X because X could be censored. And it was just, it's kind of a mind-blowing kind of thing. Oh, okay, yeah, he's got a concern about censorship that maybe I don't have here in the US, and that affects how he's interacting with the software. And you can really start to get a wide community. One of the trends I was talking about with Liz that I'm seeing is oftentimes on these projects, when I join a company, so at Docker, we had people regularly working somewhere else. Writers in Australia, we had a writer in Seattle, we had developers in France. They're very big remote teams. So if you're interested in working remotely, I think it's a great place to start to look for a next job in open source. I'm happy as a clam. I'm an early riser. So when I wake up at 5 a.m., there's already people at work in New York. So when I get on Slack and I have a question at 6 a.m., I can get somebody to answer it. And at the end of my day, which is 3 p.m. because most of the people are in New York, then I get the rest of the day from 3 till whenever to have my own day. So it's a huge trend that I'm seeing. Despite the fact that there's a lot of publicity about teams wanting to work local, the trend that I'm seeing is actually the opposite. Maybe it's just a start, but I think that if you have the bent to do that kind of thing, you can definitely find those kinds of jobs. Other people who contribute, I think I touched on this a little bit. You don't have to be, if you have a friend who's an artist who's trying to make a company go, they might want to try creating a couple of logos, and that way they build their portfolio and they can get some fans. Docker used a particular artist who was a cartoon writer to do stickers and things like that, and mascots, and she got very popular from doing that kind of work. So there's not just writing. You can do other kinds of things. We touched on this. You can document the tools that build software. So if you're interested in doing that, you can, when you're writing for open source, have to teach about the development process. So if there's a whole contingent of people who are contributing, part of what you're trying to do is to teach people about how development works. So you can do that with the contributor's guide. You can do that with getting started in a lot of these tutorials. I mean, a lot of these repositories. And the other goal that I think is missing, these were all sort of writing or development goals, but you also have to evolve recurring contributors, because if somebody just comes and contributes and then goes away, they're sort of a one-time shopper. If you think of an open source project as a bank and you want more people to be putting money into the bank, you have to provide them with services, and those services are generally things around creating the community. And that creation of the community comes from very non-concrete things sometimes. It's just saying hello. Oh, you've made a contribution. Oh, I see your issue. You're having a problem. Let me try and help. These small kindnesses are what create a community in open source. And as a writer, it's really great, because if you write something new and you put it out there, you get an almost instantaneous response. And often the dialogue that we're missing when we're contributing to closed source, you know, you can get the thumbs up, like, or comment on the page, but it's sort of a discussion of your process. And to illustrate your process, you can create a community of people that are interested in what you're doing as your profession, and you can help others. So the different goals in open source. Okay, so now let's talk about the tools you use as a writer in open source. I always want the very shiny car, but oftentimes the tool you get in open source isn't that. As we talked earlier about this, contributors come from all over. They come from Africa, they come from China, they come from India, they come from Australia, and they have different access to tools. And also you have to think about in an open source project that you don't want to require a tool like FrameMaker, which costs a lot of money for them to write documentation. So the tools that you see in open source are often very easy to obtain and to learn. So this, for example, this GitHub tool is one of the basic tools. The Git command line, which you see a little bit of here in the terminal, represented by this terminal here. So Git is something that's pretty easy to learn, and GitHub they're trying to make it super usable. So those are the basic tools for interacting with the repository. You have to learn GitHub, and you have to learn Git. If you want to author, most of the tooling that I see now is, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is Markdown. Markdown based. These are things called the ASCII text editor with Markdown. Markdown is like I guess an old tagging. It's kind of like a tagging language. To me, it looks a lot like I don't know, a simplified form of ISIL, which is an old language I use. There's many tools that you can write in. Markdown isn't the only language available for writing the documentation or writing README files. ASCII doc is another one. There are a couple of different flavors of Markdown, but generally most people are using Markdown together with a static file generator. So if you've used Jekyll or Next or Hugo, these are all examples of a static file generator. At the end of the presentation, I have references to all these sites so that you can find them. There's a new sort of terminology that they're attaching to static file generator, which is Jamstack, which means JavaScript, APIs, and Markdown. So it's this new and up-and-coming sort of tag that people have attached to this kind of architecture of having Markdown, of having a couple of JavaScripts, generating a static site from Markdown. And this is what you get, is a whole ecosystem of software. And these are all examples of static file generators. And usually what happens if you encounter an open source site is they'll have a docs directory, a bunch of Markdown and images, and they're generating a static website, which they're then doing to display their product. GitHub has a wiki facility, but I rarely see it used for this kind of documentation type stuff. I think it's important when you're working in an open source community. Like I said, I think the communities in general, over and above, are full of people who are very good with working with others, if that makes any sense. But the thing to remember is when you're working in the communities that you're also working with people who have non-native speakers. So one of the things you have to do if you're working in this as a documentation person is when somebody misspells a word as simple as speaker, you have to remember that bad English does not correlate to lax knowledge. When somebody contributes at Docker or Blockstack and they're contributing to the documentation, I'm trying at that point to extract technical information from them. I don't want to spend time explaining to them passive voice or why a complicated word isn't as good as a simple word, or I don't want to teach them the mechanics of English. I would love to illustrate for them the mechanics of English by showing them if they write one way or another, it can clarify what they're trying to say. And that happens quite frequently. It's one of the best things about being a writer in open source is the process that you use as a writer today, which is hidden from so many people. We know as writers, as professionals, that writing a long email is not the same as writing a procedure or a tutorial or a chapter on something. The things that you think about when you're writing an email, yeah, they can cross the same thing. They can cross the same general areas, like you want it to be grammatically good, you want it to illustrate like you're thinking, and it can take a lot of time, but that's vastly different from writing something that someone's going to use to learn, and or somebody's going to use to get themselves out of trouble. It has to be, it takes a lot more time, and it really is a skill that you learn and you can illustrate. And I think that was one of the most fun things I had, is oftentimes I'd run into developers arguing over the best way to phrase something or convey something, and I would show them within minutes, this is how you do it. And they were like always very appreciative. Sometimes they would learn things from it. They would definitely develop an appreciation for my skill. One time I remember we were all as a community going through a README file for Docker, and somebody pinged me and said, oh, would you look at this? And I just started going through it, and the guy that was the development lead said, he goes, saw somebody ask him on Slack, well, aren't you going to commit? And he goes, well, I'm just sitting here watching Mary improve it. It's that kind of things. You can do those kinds of things as writers, is show what you're doing. It's super powerful. So you want to, when you're working with people who are contributing to an open source, is you want to leverage their technical experience. You could look at somebody making a commit of technical information and see if their comments make sense. See if they're adding documentation. Help them add documentation. Leverage their technical expertise and leverage your own and illustrate it for other people. It's really a powerful thing to do. Pull request reviews, I think we just kind of talked over that a little bit. Essentially, when somebody commits code, you review it, and this is your chance to shine, as we were just discussing, as a writer, to show what you can do. I can't reiterate this enough. Small kindnesses, humors, they build big communities. And it's so much fun when people can interact over these sites and see the humanness in others. It's really powerful. It brings people together, and it's just, like I said, it can be a lot of fun. So takeaways, I hope you have today, that you see open source as an opportunity. Try not to be daunted by the tools or the command line or the processes. It's just something new, and I'm sure as professional writers, you're all used to, I used to call it the wall. You learn something new, it takes a few days. You have to bang your head against it. Maybe it takes a week, but at the end of it, this revelation, and it all breaks through, and you have a conceptualization of what to do. And from then on, you start to fly. Helping as a contributor or concierge, or just concierge looking at issues, helping an open source project, you don't have to spend a lot of time, but it can raise your profile. If you're trying to get a job at Microsoft, if you want to get a job at Google, if there's a particular software organization near you that has an open source project, this can get you noticed. Definitely, if you're applying at one of these companies, I think it's smart to go in there and show your skill at being a writer by contributing or helping in some way. And if you aren't already aware of open source, you can pretty much guarantee, I know at least some, I would say all of you have probably used Google's Chrome at some point. So if you want to help on Chrome, if you want to just look at the tools and processes, there's so many developers in this area, and they're developing things like these tools, like Jekyll. They're developing these tools, this Jamstack technology that is impacting what you do as a writer. You might not have heard about Jamstack, probably heard about Jekyll. You might not have heard about an up-and-coming tool called Gatsby, which I think is interesting to look at for a very number of reasons, but it's coming your way. And if you get involved in looking at the tools, you can become part of a community, and you can grow your knowledge as a professional writer, and hopefully advance your career. So I'm going to have some questions here. If you want, I know Liz is going to prepare a PDF of this presentation, but there's some references here at the end that are available online.
Awesome. Mary, that was fantastic. As always, you are full of little tidbits, and I found that I had to pay really close attention. I'm so glad you let us record.
I'm sorry, I was talking to, I realized I needed to slow down. Sorry, gang.
No, that's all right. Like sometimes it's the thing that was said sort of off the side that becomes the key to understanding. All right, folks, it is time to type in your questions if you haven't already. And while you do, here's a look at what's coming up. The TC Dojo Mastermind Group is a monthly driven discussion group where attendees present their specific challenges on topics on their mind in a confidential, supportive environment. We have two going on right now. One is Everything TechCom, and the other is product focused on Arbor Text and Windchill. The Mastermind is a collaborative environment where everybody lends their experience to each other. It's been amazing to participate in and a lot of fun too. These are not free. It's a way to guarantee dedication and commitment between the participants. You can sign up at the TC Dojo website. Next month, we're going to talk about data output. The one complaint I hear over and over is that data output is ugly. It doesn't have to be. Like you, Mary, I want the shiny car, and I'm going to show you how one tool is taking lessons from other user experiences and bringing them to a world that has been neglected and code editor driven. How do you sign up? You go to the TC Dojo website, and that's just a short link that gets you right to this page. Scroll to the bottom, and you'll see what's coming up. All right, let's get to some of the questions. I have one here. Do you typically find you start most documentation from scratch, or do you start with stubs being written by developers?
Oh, okay. Usually in an open source project, there's something that is there already for you to work with. So if you're new to contributing, you can go there and try installing their project, and that would typically represent their README file, so there's usually some kind of content there. So you don't usually have to start from scratch. As you get more advanced, yeah, you can start writing things from scratch for them, but I usually say, hey, start by looking at their README. Can you reorganize it? Or can you improve it in some way? And that's usually a great place to start contributing.
Excellent. Okay, here's another one. Developers appreciating the skills of tech writers. You said that earlier. That seems like a very positive environment, which would ease the transition because it can be friendly for new contributors. Does that seem right?
Yeah, I really think, I'm always amazed at how, now it's not true of every project, but I would say almost uniformly every open source community I've run into has been full of developers who are more socially adept than I typically run into in some closed companies. So.
Interesting. So in your graphically diverse image, it looked like many, if not most, contributors are likely the non-native English speakers. Sounds like professional writers could be very valuable on open source projects.
That's true. It depends on the project, but almost I've never not encountered somebody from outside that's being a heavy contributor. People from Netherlands, people from Finland, people from China, people from Vietnam, all over. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. I don't see any more questions. You must have overwhelmed us all. And I'm sure that people will look you up on GitHub and send you questions as they come across them. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you very much for attending, people.
Oh, wait, we got a last one coming in.
Okay.
Do you get paid for this work?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the companies that I talk, do you get paid for just contributing? No, the answer to that is no. So if you I spent 2 hours contributing to Gatsby last night, that PR that you saw last night. So overall, I probably spent 5 hours contributing to them, but the project interests me and I want to learn it. So my job, which is for a company that does have open source and that I learned about through open source, they definitely pay me. But if what you're trying to do is contribute, no, you don't get paid for contributing. What can happen is you get noticed and get a job that pays you. So you want to pick and choose. Obviously, unless you're, so there's two things I think you can get out of contributing that are really powerful for writers. If you don't know Markdown, go to Jekyll. Jekyll is an open source project. By contributing to Jekyll, you will learn Markdown. And then you can update your resume and say, Jekyll. And you will have proof on GitHub because you would have contributed that you knew what you were talking about. As opposed to, oh, I hope I get a job with a company that's doing Markdown. Well, I mean, why wait? You can contribute and then maybe get the next job that you want. If you're interested in, but do you get money for contributing? No. It's interesting though, go back to the survey at Stack Overflow. Right now, developers are getting jobs from the work that they do contributing. And I think it can be true for technical writers.
Fascinating. That's pretty cool. That last bit is really interesting because if you're getting paid in social capital, you're getting noticed. And if that turns into consulting money, that's interesting.
Right. So if I would look. Google has Google has headquarters all over, but they also very much support remote work. GitHub, I know, has most everybody that's on their team are remote. So if you're working in North Carolina, or you're working in Missouri, or you're working in Florida, or you're working in Montana, and you want to work for Google, but you don't want to move, then contribute and see, and then apply. So, maybe you contribute for a month, and then maybe you apply and you point to your contribution and you get a job where you can work in Montana for Google, and you don't have to move to Mountain View or wherever the closest Google is to you. You can stay where you are, and that's entirely possible.
Awesome. All right. Great answers. Great session. Thank you, Mary. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, everybody.
Everyone, we'll see you next time.
All right,
thanks for coming. And remember, it's all about you. Subscribe to our mailing list so that you don't miss another live session. That's your only chance to ask questions of the presenters if you're there live. Thanks, everyone. Bye.